What first drew your attention to President Coolidge?
Oh gosh, years and years and years ago, I was fascinated by the political turmoil of 1919, 1920, when riots were happening all across the country, when there's a great deal of suppression of political thought, raids on people's homes, and I was just amazed. And of course, this was going back when I was in my 20s, I suspect, and there was a fervent period of protest then as well, so there was a nice parallel between those two periods. And that led me to really kind of think about and study the period that followed that, which was so different than that particular period. Why was that different? So Coolidge became a part of that whole story. And then, of course, I got very interested in the lead up to the Great Depression. Why was the 20s so prosperous and the 30s so not prosperous? The two decades stand like bookends in the history of prosperity. So that also was another reason why I was interested. Later, Amity Shlaes and her research just really brought everything together. So I got back to the subject after meeting Amity many, many years ago.
Wonderful. So you just finished up the panel, and there were lots of thought-provoking ideas and questions also asked. What were some of the main themes that were either brought out by questions or that you wanted to convey about the main thrust of the panel?
Well, my main point was that we have in the 1919 to 1923 period, that fruitful four-year period, a lot of data which is relevant to us now. It isn't that it's just people doing things. They were doing things similar to us and addressing problems, from pandemic of 1919 to budget excesses to inflation to political turmoil. That period is very like our period. And that was my main point. You should go back to that period and study it for what you can learn from that. Then in the Q&As that followed, we got a lot of questions, especially from the students, about, what was different about the budget process? How does Congress set its priorities now and then? What can we learn from that? And I think that's what people need to be asking. I think that's really good. So yeah, that was my main point. I must say that we oversell the political turmoil of our own time. Political turmoil in U.S. history is a constant. Almost no time has there not been one side trying to pummel the other side. That's just part of what we are. So that to one side, the pandemic, the inflation, the budget excesses really tie our times to their times. And how does that now inform what we need to do? So I think that's what we need to be thinking about, and that was why I was here today.
Well, I'm glad the students were able to hear from you and to hear what might be really important moving forward. And it's also, like you said, it's great that they're asking the right questions to start off with.
Sure.
We've spent a lot of time at this conference so far discussing exactly how the lessons that Coolidge's legacy exemplify can be applied today. In celebrating his centennial, we're trying to really find some inspiration there. So maybe if you could touch on one or two of the most important themes that you think Coolidge's life as a president or just as a person can tell public servants or just citizens overall about.
Right.
Yeah.
So one of the things which typifies great leaders over all of human history is the quiet leadership of really successful people. Now, Calvin Coolidge he's got bad press. He was not Silent Cal. He loved to joke. He had a practical line to him. But what was different was that he would thoroughly study something, look at and think about all the alternatives, and then not go out and advertise what he was thinking. He would begin to execute, begin to compromise, begin to work behind the scenes, and then persist to his goals and achieve those goals. I think Eisenhower is the one that goes most like Coolidge in the 20th century. Eisenhower was the master craftsperson, very deceptive, but in an honest way. And Coolidge had those characteristics too. So that's why he was so successful in so many different areas. Then again, he did some things against his judgment in order to get to bigger goals. I think the Immigration Act was something he would have loved to have walked away from. Right. But he couldn't do so and get Congress to ultimately pass the scientific legislation, scientific taxation-led legislation. You know, Mellon's bill languished for year after year and had to be carefully nurtured through compromises to get it done. But what a great achievement. And so I think that's one of the things that we learn about Coolidge that others today should take to heart. Leadership is not being in front of the line. A lot of times the best leaders are not at the front, or the best leaders are not the ones that are heard. You know, in Eisenhower's time, for example, Senator Nolan was the leader of the Senate, and he was a very brash guy, a very loud guy, but he got nothing done. And Eisenhower got all this stuff done. And the same thing with Senator Borah, La Follette in the 1920s. Loud is not necessarily bad, but you know what I mean? They were leading by shouting and leading by exuberance. But the real craftsperson of progress was somebody who was thinking about the alternatives, carefully working in the background, and got things done. So he is a good example of leadership, as well as of statesmanship, as well as someone who is identified with legislation, which in the case of the Budget Act made all the difference to the 20th century.
So sort of more of a producer-director rather than the star of the show behind in front of the lights. Right.
And I think that's an important characteristic of the presidency that most presidents ultimately learn. Even someone who was so in front of cameras as Ronald Reagan ultimately is known mainly as the orchestrator of others' accomplishments. And so really good administrators, governors, whatever, business leaders, they have that characteristic. And that's one that we can see very visibly, and Coolidge made all the more visible now that we have this wonderful biography by Amity. Yeah.
Do you think that future generations will emphasize different aspects of Coolidge than we do right now? So maybe at the bicentennial, what sort of themes do you think future generations might think are really prescient?
Yeah, so here's what I think about that, and it's not a great thought, it's maybe even a dumb thought. So the United States is predicted to be the third fastest growing country in the world by 2021, by 2100, 2100. The largest country in the world is Kenya. Second largest is another African republic, Democratic Republic of Congo. I have no doubts about that. This is the UN projections. They just were published. And the third largest country in the world is the United States. Why will we will be so great and large? It's because most of our increase will come from immigration. So in 100 years, I think we'll look back at Coolidge, which would be like 200 years, and we'll say, what did he do to expand opportunity, to expand the pie? So because people just flooded into this country in the 1920s, and then after the war in the 1950s. But the 1920s is a period of expansive immigration. They'll look at the Immigration Act, which he reluctantly signed, the Japanese Exclusion basically Act, and say, that's not the direction we could go. But there were other things which counterbalance that, and that's what they'll say, because to accommodate the size of the population, we'll almost have 1 billion people in this country. We will have to have immense opportunity, just tremendous growth of the ability of people to do well here. And so the 20s is a period of prosperity, which we look now and it's cute, it's kind of fun, there's flappers and so forth and so on. A little bit worried about the 29 crash, but I think we oversell that. Boom. This is going to be, what kind of a country did Coolidge help? Not create, didn't create anything, but to nurture, to support. that accommodated such an increase in the population of that time, because I think that's going to be the biggest challenge over the next 75 years. People your age will be working with the population issue not in a negative way. It's going to be a very positive. You bring lots of people here, they have lots of ideas, lots of brain power. We want the best people to migrate to the United States. And so massive prosperity will be the problem to be solved.
Fascinating. That was a really great answer. Do you think that, maybe I'll go with, are there any themes that were not touched on in the panel that you maybe wish you had had enough time to get to?
So I'm actually very concerned about inflation right now. My agency issues the inflation reports every month, CPI, PPI, import and export price indexes. And even though we've seen some improvement, we're now talking, in February, that improvement is not stable. Big increases in certain components make me worried. And why am I worried about that? Because inflation is more corrosive than recession to economic activity. Recessions have predictable patterns. Inflation, however, is like an unpredictable virus. It goes in so many different. If you just illustrate on the defense budget that I mentioned briefly this morning, Congress has to do an annual appropriation, but with inflation, they don't know what's going to happen in 5 years. Of course, nobody does, but it's even less predictable. So they have to make decisions about higher priority, lower priority, and right now, lower priority might be cutting something that's really important to our defense because we just can't afford it, over a 5-year period, over a 4-year authorization period. Strategic planners at the Defense Department with our readiness survey and our nuclear posture survey and so forth and so on, they have to predict what others, agents, enemies and allies are going to do, but they're also enemies and allies suffering from inflation. They don't know what their capacities are, so it makes planning more difficult. And then the private sector that produces all the defense stuff from, computer code to battleships, well, we don't do battleships anymore, but, large floating ships. It's more difficult for them to engage in it. And so inflation is a direct threat to our national security in a way that people don't really visualize. They don't see it that way. They just see eggs and gas and stuff like that, which is fine. So I think the one thing I wanted to say, didn't have time to say, is that the 20s again show us how inflation, for some reason, inflation just disappeared. And we had a growing population, growing prosperity, and the price levels were apparently very stable from about 1921 on to about 1932. Then we had deflation, which is the other side of inflation. But I think that's a lesson from the 20s we need to really very, very closely look at. The last person to really look at that was Milton Friedman and Anna Jacobson Schwartz in their Monetary History of the United States. They spent a lot of time wondering why that price stability was so easily attained without a Federal Reserve actively pushing for it. We had a Federal Reserve, but it didn't have that mandate at the time. So I think that's one of the things if I'd had another hour, we could have talked about it.
Well, we thank you for the hour you gave us. It was really, really great. And thank you for giving us the opportunity to record some of your thoughts. So we really appreciate it.
Thanks, Sam. My pleasure.